In this tutorial, we'll take an in-depth look at the different watercolor techniques described on this poster. Let's get started. The most basic technique for watercolor is a wet-on-dry technique, where we have a wet brush painting onto a dry piece of paper. This technique is the most common, and it's used to create even layers throughout our compositions. Another common technique is called wet on wet, where we use a wet brush to paint on a piece of paper that is already wet. So first I'm going to wet my paper, at least the spot that I want to paint on. And I'm going to make sure that I have an even layer of wetness. So I don't want any water pooling in any of the edges or in the center of my paper. Next, I'm going to mix my pigment, and as I'm mixing, I'm going to make sure that I have a dense version of pigment. So I'm not going to add quite as much water to my pigment. The reason being is the more water we add on wet, the more our color is going to disperse in that water. So since I have a fairly dense amount of pigment on my paint, you'll notice that the pigment is spreading, but it's not completely overtaking the wet area. I can also blend in the color onto my paper by cleaning off my brush first and making sure that it's not wet, and then softly and gently blending the edges of my color. This technique called dropping color is just simply a way to explain what we're doing as artists. So if somebody says that they're dropping color into their watercolor piece, it simply means that they're painting wet on wet and using a concentrated amount of pigment and dropping that pigment onto an already wet segment of paper. Now, when we drop color into a painting, most of the time we can let the water move the pigment around the paper, but we also have to be careful about how our pigments are going to blend with each other. This technique is a perfect way for beginners to practice and to experiment to see how the water moves the pigment across the paper. This next technique is the opposite of dropping in color, and that would be lifting color. So as artists, if we have a section of paper that is painted with a solid color, or if we make a mistake and we need to clean up a certain section, we can what's called lift the color off of the paper. First step is to completely dry your brush or use a new brush that was never wet, and you're going to simply lift some of the pigment off of the paper. You're going to have to clean your brush multiple times, and please do not do this with a wet brush. If you try doing this with a wet brush, you'll notice all kinds of things happening like blooms and backwash, and the water in your brush will actually cause the pigment to spread outwards. This is a great technique to use if you've added too dark of a pigment to your paper and you'd like to lighten it up. Blooms, also known as cauliflowers, are sunburst-like shapes that are created from adding water to your damp section of paper. There are some artists that love incorporating blooms into their paintings on purpose, and other artists try to avoid it at all costs. A bloom happens when you have a damp section of paper that's not pooling with water, and then you yourself add, using a wet brush, either water or color to that damp sheet of paper. And the water will push the color that's already on the paper into this sunburst type pattern. You just want to be aware that this will happen if you touch a segment of your paper that is already damp. A dry brush technique is a great way to add textures to your paintings. So after we mix our color, of course we have to use water to mix our color, we're going to dab our brush onto a piece of paper towel or a towel in order to get some of that liquid off, and then use a quick stroke to create a little bit of texture with our brush. This is a great way to use some of your unique specialty brushes, such as a fan brush, to create textures such as grass or fur. One of the techniques that I use very often while painting pet portrait commissions is that of layering. Layering in watercolor is used to create depth, and on occasion also used to combine colors and create new colors. With each subsequent layer, you'll need to make sure that your first layer has properly dried. If it is not dry, then you're going to get some mixing and seeping of colors, potentially in areas that you do not want them to go. Most of the time that we layer colors, we'll start with lighter colors first, and then slowly work and build the depth of color by adding darker colors in all of our subsequent layers. In this example of layering, I am using one single color, but it's a great way for beginners to be able to play with color theory and layer different colors one on top of the other to create new colors. Negative painting is a technique where instead of painting the actual subject, you're painting around the subject. So in the example that I'm painting right now, instead of painting the actual hearts inside the hearts, I'm painting around them. So I'm painting the negative space around the hearts. I use this technique all the time in my pet portrait paintings when I paint white fur. Obviously, I cannot paint individual strands of white fur like I could in acrylic or oils. And so with watercolors, we have to paint negatively around those white furs. So we're actually painting the shadows and the spaces behind. There are some artists who also like to combine two different techniques, the technique of layering and the technique of negative painting. So in this example, I'm adding a second layer to my first negative painting. And you'll notice that only some of the original areas are going to shine through. This technique is used often by landscape artists. So you might notice layering of negative painting for things like trees and leaves. Masking fluid is a tool that a lot of watercolor artists will use if they want to keep certain areas of their paper protected from the colors they're using. In this example, I am using masking fluid over white paper in order to protect those areas from the paint that I'm going to lay on top. When you're using masking fluid, make sure to use an old brush that you don't mind ruining, because the masking fluid is often very difficult to clean from your brush. As a pet portrait artist, I often use a pen with a nib in order to draw the whiskers using masking fluid. I find that a brush does not give me a fine enough line, and a pen with a simple nib on it will often give me a very fine line. You'll have to wait some time in order to let the masking fluid dry before you can paint on top. After your paint has dried, you can take a simple kneaded eraser in order to remove your masking fluid. If you purchase quality masking fluid, you shouldn't have a problem removing the masking fluid from your paper, and it should not rip your paper. To splatter paint onto your painting, simply use a loaded brush and keep it stationary as you tap it on top with another dry brush or pencil. Using salt is a great way to add texture to your painting. The first step is to paint a solid layer of color. Make sure that this layer of color is not too dry or not too wet, or otherwise the salt won't work. Once your painting is damp, use coarse sea salt and gently sprinkle the coarse sea salt grains on top of your paint. You'll have to wait until your paint is completely dry before you can brush off the salt crystals. This technique works well to mimic stars in the sky, snow falling, and even bubbles underwater. Another household good that creates a very interesting texture in watercolor is plastic wrap. The first step is to paint a solid layer of color using wet on dry technique, and make sure that you have quite a bit of pigment and water in this layer. However, we do not want our pigment to be pooling in any one area. Take your plastic wrap, place it on top of the area you painted, and simply smush it together slightly in the areas that you want to create interest. Once your painting is completely dry, you can remove the plastic wrap and see the results. A lot of us have bubble wrap from packaging and Amazon packaging that we can use to create interesting textures in watercolor. First, start by painting an even layer of color. Make sure that it is damp but not pooling in any area. Then take your bubble wrap and place it face down onto your wet paper. Slightly tap down and press down and leave the bubble wrap on as it dries. I hope you enjoyed this beginner's introduction to watercolor techniques. You can find the PDF download of this poster on my website. The link to my website is in the description below. And while you're there, make sure to sign up for my email list so that you can keep up to date on all my new in-person classes and online tutorials. Thanks for watching.